So welcome to this week's question and answer video. Actually, be another one based on the snippets from Sunday. So these were from the snippets from last Thursday. So a few sets of quite good questions. So the first two questions dealt with Congress and U.S. foreign policy. So the first, whether there were any major consequences of Taft sending Marines to Nicaragua without congressional approval, which of course, the Constitution says the presidents aren't supposed to be able to do. And then the second, a few years back in time, what the popular sentiment was among Congress about providing the Dominican finances deal by Theodore Roosevelt that in effect established a U.S. protectorate over Nicaragua, whether the American public was particularly opinionated about it. By and large, until the 1920s, public opinion was really not much engaged with U.S. policy towards the Caribbean basin. The exception to this was U.S. intervention in Mexico under Wilson, which was a big issue domestically. But the U.S. interventions in Cuba after the passage of the Platt Amendment, U.S. sends Marines there in 1906. U.S. intervention in Haiti by Wilson during World War I, in the Dominican Republic under either Theodore Roosevelt or Wilson, and Taft's intervention in Nicaragua largely escaped U.S. Public attention. That said, both of these actions, especially Taft's, do arouse some opposition in Congress, and the most significant of these figures, I think, at this point, are Robert La Follette on the right, Republican senator from Wisconsin, and George Norris on the left, a Republican congressman from Nebraska, who's then elected to the Senate in 1912. Both La Follette and Norris are Midwestern Republicans. This is a period in American history where the Midwest is essentially a one-party region, sort of like the South was a one-party Democratic region. So the real battle in these Midwestern states is in the Republican Party primary. And there's a left-wing populistic wing and then a more pro-business conservative wing. And La Follette and Norris are two of the most prominent figures in the left-wing populistic wing. So these are people who are Republicans at the time, but in the current political environment, they would be seen as quite liberal Democrats. They are both interested in what they see as excessive corporate power. They believe that big business exercises too much of an influence over U.S. foreign relations, and as a result, they take this kind of populistic view towards the Caribbean Basin policies, where they argue that both Roosevelt and especially Taft, both of them are very sharp critics of Taft, have sort of farmed out U.S. foreign policy to business interests. They see the intervention as a pro-business intervention, and they call for more aggressive congressional opposition to presidential policies. At this point, they don't have a lot of support in Congress, and the political breakdown in Congress really doesn't do them any favors in this regard. But this is going to set the stage for what we'll be looking at not next week, but the following week when we look at the 1920s, where there is a kind of full-scale congressional rebellion against excessive executive interventionism in the Caribbean Basin. So this is a starting point, but only a starting point. For the most part, Congress is quiescent. On the Dominican issue, there is one other strand of opposition, and that comes from a handful of fairly conservative Democrats, most prominent of whom was a Maryland senator with the wonderful name of Isidore Rayner, one of my favorite Senate names. And these are people who were quite conservative, in many ways segregationist Democrats, but they're worried about Roosevelt's excessive, aggressive interpretation of executive power potentially being used to promote civil rights in the South. So it's this odd kind of left-right alliance in Congress. You have the Norrises and the La Follettes on the left, and people like Rayner on the right. But they don't really provide a meaningful check on either Roosevelt or Taft. But they are, as I said, going to set the stage for things to come later on. Second question looked at European affairs. There was a chart shown comparing the German and French populations over a 40-year period. Massive increase in the German population, growth entirely internal to Germany, just to take into account ethnically German peoples and newly conquered territories as well. This is an excellent question. So here's a map of the creation of the German Empire. So, what we think of as Germany as of 1862 is just the deep purple area, Prussia, which is headed by the Prussian monarchy, who becomes the German monarchy. Then we have all of these kind of sort of little city states here in central Germany, and then Bavaria in southern Germany, which was under the influence of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Germany fights a war with Austria-Hungary in 1866. It's a decisive German victory. Austria agrees to stay out of the issue of German unification, and as a result, you see between 1866 and 1871 fairly rapid unification of this area. And then in 1870, 1871, there's a war between it's still called Prussia and France, which is a decisive German victory. The Germans occupied Paris. And as a result of that war, France agrees to cede to Germany these two border provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, which are strategically very important and have something of a mixed population, although they're more French than German. So part of it, the chart that I showed in the in class did take into account Germany pre-Alsace-Lorraine. So the conquest of Alsace and Lorraine does affect things, but not these other conquests. They were already part of the German total. But Germany's borders then do not change at all between 1871 and 1914. So that is more the growth just of Germany internally. Germany's economy takes off in the late 19th century. It's a much more robust country, and I think it is, to me, one of these great counterfactual questions. If Germany hadn't kind of aggressively moved towards the First World War, Germany was a country that was gaining in power in the 1900s and 19-teens. France is really declining, and so the decision to go to war in 1914 was strategically catastrophic for Germany. And then the last question from this week's batch, something I found a bit confusing was the invitation the U.S. received to participate in the Algeciras conference, because, correctly, what does Morocco have to do with the United States? And the starting point, this too is a very good question. The starting point for this is this conflict in 1899, 1900, called the Boer War, B-O-E-R, between the British, who had colonized most of coastal South Africa, and the Boers, who are inheritors of Dutch German colonists from an earlier period, who had created this so-called Orange Free State. The British win the war. The Boers eventually will set the stage for post World War II South Africa. The Boers are the ones who really pushed the origins of apartheid. But this war is, even though the British win, it's a PR disaster for the British. They have no real international support at all. And until this time, Britain had taken a policy of a kind of isolationism, a real reluctance to enter into any sort of alliances with other countries. And the British government, in the aftermath of this, are very concerned that they might become isolated internationally, and that could advantage the Germans. So in East Asia, Britain enters into an alliance with Japan in 1902. In the Western Hemisphere, as we read about in the Mitchell piece for last week, the British don't push very hard in the Venezuelan crisis. As soon as the U.S. makes clear it doesn't like what the European powers are doing, the British kind of back off. And what you see in Algeciras is part of this desire by the British to kind of pull the U.S. in to European affairs, out of a sense that British and American strategic interests are complementary enough that if the U.S. is more active in European affairs, that's going to work to the advantage of the British. So the question here is absolutely correct. I mean, the U.S. basically has no interest in whether the French or the Germans are the primary colonial power in Morocco. But from the standpoint of the British, this is part of a series of moves in the early part of the 20th century to reach out to growing powers, either Japan and East Asia or the US and the Western Hemisphere, try to reach some kind of accommodation with them to ensure that if and when there is another major international crisis like what occurred in the Boer War, the British are not left completely isolated. So those are the questions for this week. Excellent questions this time. Please remember to keep them coming with the quizzes. And I will talk to everyone soon.